Hey guys, how's it going? Oh, where'd I go? Where'd I go? First I'm over here, and now I'm over there. Alright, I'll stop messing around. Let's get started. Reconstruction, Chapter 15. Okay, so what exactly was Reconstruction? Reconstruction was a period during which the U.S. began to rebuild after the Civil War. It lasted from 1865 at the end of it to 1877. We had three presidents who were in charge during this time doing it. We had Lincoln, we had Andrew Johnson, and we had Grant. But the basic problem that we were seeing is that Congress was really fighting all the presidents hard over who should really be the one in charge of reconstructing the South. If you look at this picture, this is the devastation that we were seeing in the South. This was after the Sherman's March to the Sea.
Hi, this is Abraham Lincoln with my crazy voice. And I had a very lenient plan for Reconstruction. I had the 10% plan, where I wanted to give amnesty to everybody who decided to join the United States again. And by everybody, I meant only 10%. That's all that needed to agree to my beliefs. But we will see that that's not really going to be a plan that people are going to like. People thought I was being way too lenient and I needed to treat them bad in the South.
Oh my gosh, that was the ghost of Abraham Lincoln talking to you guys. That was so creepy, but so awesome. So, what did the radical Republicans think about Lincoln's plan? They didn't like it. They wanted to completely destroy the political power in the South. Now, who are the leaders of the radical Republicans? We have Thaddeus Stevens and Senator, I almost got beat to death within an inch of my life, Charles Sumner. The radical Republicans in 1864 come up with a plan that would go against Lincoln's plan, the 10% plan, and they call it the Wade-Davis Bill, which basically said that Congress would take care of Reconstruction, not the president, and they would do so by making sure that over 50% of the state agreed to swearing allegiance to the Union before they got readmitted, and that all of the Southern leaders would be completely disfranchised, and that Northern leaders would be the ones taking over. Lincoln thought that this was way too harsh, so he was able to pocket veto this, meaning he didn't sign it nor veto it, but because it was the end of a session, for Congress, the bill just died. Radical Republicans were pretty upset about this, as I'm sure you could probably guess. So Lincoln's dead. He got assassinated, as we know, and now we have a new president. Andrew Johnson is the 17th president of the United States. South hated him. They thought he was a traitor since he was from Tennessee and supported the North. The radical Republicans thought he was on their side, but both were very wrong. He really made a lot of enemies. He did create his own idea for Reconstruction, known as presidential Reconstruction, and he basically said if you want back in South to become a state, to have representation in Congress and have electoral votes, you need to do three things. Number one, you need to withdraw your secession. Number two, you need to swear allegiance to the Union, and he was expecting more than 50% of each state to do so, not Lincoln's 10%. And they needed to annul or void all of their Confederate war debts before they were to enter in the Union. At the time, once Johnson was president, Congress had a plan of what they wanted to do with Reconstruction. Well, first of all, anytime the Southerners came knocking at their door wanting to get into Congress again because they got readmitted to the Union, they refused to let them in. They're like, you didn't change your ways. Why would I even want to let you in here? So number one, there were some animosities there. Some of the plans that they did pass, and this tends to be considered one of the most successful of Reconstruction, would be the Freedmen's Bureau, where they basically assisted not only poor black people, but poor white people in the South with food and shelter and clothing, sometimes even education. They also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 at the time, which basically they decided to give African Americans citizenship and forbade the passing of black codes in the South, which were discriminatory laws that segregated black and white people in the South. Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but they had the 2/3 majority in the House, and they were able to override both vetoes. Another successful piece of legislation that was passed was actually an amendment, the 14th Amendment, where it says that all people born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, and those citizens cannot be deprived due process of law and have equal protection under the law, no matter what states decide they can do. They were doing that basically to protect black citizens, the freedmen in the South, because states were trying to make those black code laws, and eventually we'll see Jim Crow laws. Also during this time, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 was passed. It was vetoed by Johnson again, and it was overridden again. This one was a little bit controversial, though. It actually set up the 10 remaining southern states that hadn't been readmitted to the Union yet into 5 military districts. So it was kind of being run by martial law, which is kind of not very democratic. So if you could not tell, and if you didn't know, Congress wasn't really a big fan of Andrew Johnson since he vetoed everything they tried to do. So they're like, how about we get this guy out of office sooner than November 1868? Let's try at the beginning of 1868 because we can't stand him that much. What are we going to do? How do we get this guy out of office? I know. Let's make up a bogus law that we know he's going to break. So that's what they did. They created the Tenure of Office Act, which basically said that anybody who the president hires cannot be fired by that president unless the Senate agrees to it, because they knew he was going to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He wasn't a big fan of this guy. They didn't get along. They knew it was in the works, so they're like, let's make it illegal for him to do that. So Johnson's like, this law is bogus, I'm vetoing it, and of course the Congress overrode it, and he still broke it. So he got impeached, which means you are formally charged for an offense. That happened in the House. Now, the step 2 that we're going to look at is where the Senate decides and has a trial of whether or not he should be removed from office, and by 1 vote, he was able to stay in office. But again, this is like May of 1868. He's got a good 5 months before the election, and he's going to be voted out. The Republicans put their backing behind war hero Ulysses S. Grant to run for president in 1868, and he does win. And with that win, they used that victory to get the 15th Amendment passed, which gave suffrage to all men regardless of race. So we're seeing another example of Reconstruction that was actually good. They also tried to, while he was in office, pass the Enforcement Act of 1870, which basically said the federal government had the right to punish anyone preventing black people from voting. So a lot of things were done during this time that actually helped black people in the South, but we're going to see that that's going to fall apart very quickly. Now that we've talked about the politics of Reconstruction, now we're going to talk about society during Reconstruction, and first we're going to look at the South. So what was going on now in the South? Well, it was pretty bad. The destruction in the South was horrific, not only because of the war, but just Sherman's march to the sea alone cost about $100 million worth of damage. Also, they had no workforce. About 1/5 or 20% of their men were dead because of the war. But some good things came out of it. Because it was so destroyed, the government needed to rebuild it. And to rebuild something, you need to create jobs. And that gave a lot of white people and black people in the South some jobs, like rebuilding railroads, rebuilding bridges and roads. They also established orphanages and schools during this time period, but at the same time, there's no such, Economics 101, there is no such thing as a free lunch. This stuff comes at a price, and that is to the taxpayers. As we've learned in class before, the South was dominated by Democrats at the time, but there were some groups that weren't Democrats in the South, and they were absolutely ridiculed by the Democrats of the South. One of the groups was scalawags. These were white Republicans in the South that the Democrats felt threatened by and didn't like. That was their derogatory name for them, was scalawags. Why didn't they like them? Because they were white people who wanted to help the advancement of blacks. And of course, the Democrats in the South didn't like that at the time. They also were very threatened by a group called, which they dubbed carpetbaggers, which were people that were from the North that were moving to the South during Reconstruction to help rebuild it, where the South felt that they were really trying to take over and exploit them for their goods when really they were just trying to help them. When it came to voting at the time, it was actually pretty good. About 90% of black men in the South were voting. We're going to see a change with that, and we'll explain that later. But they were pretty much voting for the Republicans because there are huge differences between Democrats and the Republicans, and the biggest one was this. Republicans fought for the civil rights of blacks, while Democrats opposed any type of rights for blacks in the South. So the Republicans were thinking very Lincoln style, like, how do we get these guys on our side? Maybe we can work with the Democrats. I know what we can do. Let's get them on our side by appointing them to offices underneath our watch, and then maybe they'll work with us. Well, guess what? When they appointed them to these offices, the Democrats gained power and they pushed all that they could behind these Jim Crow laws and black codes. And as a black person in the South, you would feel very abandoned and you feel very betrayed by the Republicans because you're like, you're helping out the enemy, you're working with them when all they're trying to do is hurt us. I don't understand. So black people in the South at the time felt very, very betrayed by the Republicans. Okay, once these slaves became freedmen, what do? Where do they go? They have nothing. So they have to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. Well, some of them moved to the cities to find jobs. Some didn't focus on jobs at first. Some focused on being reunited with their families, and about 1/3 of families were reunited that had been divided during the time of slavery. So some also worked on becoming not illiterate, but becoming literate. And by 1870, 80% of African Americans were illiterate, could not read. So we're trying to see a switch in those numbers and make sure that more African Americans can be literate and read. It'll help them with jobs. Many founded their own churches and volunteer groups, and basically communities revolved around these churches, and ministers became major leaders in communities. Many black people at the time in the South tried to get into politics, and several actually succeeded. Most were at the local and state level positions, but we did see a few members join the House of Representatives. Hiram Revels, for instance, was the first black senator in the history of the Senate. So that's really interesting that we're seeing this. The first 2 black senators ever were actually, including Hiram Revels, were from Mississippi. Many black codes and segregation was not allowed during this time. We are going to see that change, and I'll explain that later. But at the time, it wasn't, African Americans were more on the Malcolm X page of things, where they were more about the community rather than full integration, where, something that somebody like MLK, Jr. would prefer. During Reconstruction, there were major changes in the economy in the South. 1/5 of the workforce was dead, but all of a sudden there's a huge new workforce with the freedmen. And we see they need to find jobs and figure out what to do. Well, during the war, General Sherman from the North promised any black people in the South who fought for the Union after the war was over 40 acres and a mule, which the government would issue them 40 acres to farm and military mules to help, farm the land. Well, they got that land, but they were giving them land that they basically took from planters who already owned it in the South. And Johnson realized that was a little wrong. Even the radical Republicans were a little iffy with that. So he took back the land that was given to them. Now, African Americans were upset about this because they were promised something and then it got taken away from them. So they fought it, and in 1866, they passed another Homestead Act, which gave them the 40 acres they were promised, but the acres that they were given weren't really good. They were unstable. Many times they got swampland or forest land they couldn't do anything with. Okay. So planters were having major problems at the time. They were having a really hard time finding people to work for them because of the fact that no one wanted to feel like a slave working for them. And even if they could find people to work for them, they'd have to pay them, so they really weren't making a profit anymore since they had to pay their laborers, which is the largest cost of any business. And not only did black people not want to work for them, white people didn't want to work for them either. So most former slaves at the time were taking jobs outside of the farm. They were working in the cities, working on the railroads, even subsistence farming on their own. And also, cotton no longer was king during this time. Here's what happened. Because of this whole crop lien system and everybody could pay general stores in cash crops, everybody was growing the cash crop of cotton. And other countries were also growing this product as well. So because of that, everyone's growing it. The value starts to plummet in the South, and people start freaking out, and they're like, I know, the best idea is to, of course, make more cotton, because producing more of something would cause it to have devalues. So that's the major problem we're seeing at the time. Poor black and poor white farmers had really few choices at the time to figure out what to do with farming. So they basically could do one of two things. Both were forms of tenant farming. One was sharecropping, which most of them did, where landowners would lend out some of their land to these farmers, and they, in turn, at the end of the year, would have to give half of their crop to the farmers. The other half they could do with what they want. The other was tenant farming, where it's just like a tenant and a landlord. You just pay rent. Very few could do this because it just costs too much money. So the people that opposed Reconstruction were known as the Ku Klux Klan. I'm sure you've heard of them before. They looked a little bit like this. Yeah, that's them. So anyway, they started in 1866 in Tennessee as a Confederate veterans social group. They just were hanging out, and they're like recollecting the war, and oh, we're so great, and we're the South, and oh, we just barely lost that war, we shouldn't have lost it, and oh, by the way, I hate black people. What? Oh my gosh. So anyway, they just left and decided to go and terrorize all different types of not only black people but white sympathizers in the South. They would burn homes, they would set crosses on fire in front of their homes, they would literally kill as well just to keep black people from having any type of rights or voting. They even went to the lengths of killing white politicians who were supporting Civil Rights Act in Congress, including that of Republican John Stevens. So it was pretty awful what they were doing. And eventually they did die down, but because they met their goal of pretty much scaring the living daylights out of anyone in the South, especially black people, from voting. So fortunately they died off, but unfortunately they died off for the reasons that they met their goals. The black population was having high unemployment rates at the time for the really only reason that they couldn't find jobs because white people were too afraid to hire them because of the repercussions by the Ku Klux Klan. And they weren't voting either. They were scared to death because of the Ku Klux Klan to vote. So President Grant decided to try and help them by passing the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, that were trying to have federal intervention to make sure that black people could vote so they wouldn't be afraid. But here are the results. It didn't really work well because Grant never really used his power, and then the Supreme Court ended up finding it unconstitutional. Also, the Klan activity did decrease, like I said, but it was just because they had gained white supremacy in the South again, which is what they wanted. And as a result, the Democrats who were for white supremacy and opposed civil rights for blacks, they got all the power in the South, and the Republicans who supported civil rights were out. So really, people in the South, black people in the South, really had no hope at the time. Another thing that kind of brought Reconstruction to a halt were the scandals and the money crises that were hurting the Republicans because of Grant's administration. He was very naive. He was an honest man, but he was very naive. He had no clue what was going on in his administration beneath him. They were very crooked. He had his vice president taking bribes. He had his Secretary of War taking bribes. He had his Secretary of Treasury being involved in the whiskey ring where they were basically cheating the tax system. And he didn't know it. He just didn't want to believe it to be true. He's like, that's not happening. And he just kind of ignored it, not thinking it was actually true. And it really upset a lot of Republicans. They're like, seriously, get these guys out of here. They're very corrupt. They're making us look bad. But he's like, no, whatever. So it split the party up. You've got the Republican Party and then the liberal Republican Party. And as we know, as my great Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Another cause at the end of Reconstruction was the Panic of 1873. It was the worst economic crisis up to this time period. Why? Because Northerners and Southerners were investing in the South, borrowing way too much money, and they weren't getting any of it back, and that caused many of the banks to fail. By 1875, this can show you how bad it was. 89 railroads went broke, 18,000 companies went bust, and over 3 million people were unemployed, which is not only a large number in general, but a very large number back then when the population was much smaller than it is today. Grant didn't really know what to do, so he's like, I think because there's so much paper money out there, it's going to become worthless. We need to back up money by gold. So he passed the Specie Resumption Act, which basically said that the government would pay you for your greenbacks, your paper currency, and then they'd issue a new type of currency that was only backed up by gold. Well, this hurt a lot of people because that really took money out of circulation, and their money wasn't worth nearly as much under the gold system. Next comes the election of 1876. It's Democrat Samuel Tilden going against Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, this is interesting because Sam Tilden actually wins the popular vote, but he doesn't win the electoral vote. He's off by one vote, so the vote has to go to the House. And in the House, they make what's known as the Compromise of 1877, where they make a deal with Rutherford B. Hayes that he could be president. They would vote him as president as long as, number one, he would get the military troops out of the South for the remaining southern states. Number two, they would give them home rule so the South can kind of rule and do as they please. He would only serve one term. And the fourth thing is that he would put southern Democrats on his cabinet. So by doing this, he made a deal, and it really pretty much ended Reconstruction because Reconstruction was about the national government getting involved in fixing the South. Well, if he's pulling out all the troops and letting them do as they please in the South, it's over with. And the Southerners who took charge, the Democrats who took charge, called themselves the Redeemers, while others called them Bourbons, but the ones who criticized them called them Bourbons, but they felt like they were redeeming the South to its old ways. What exactly is home rule? It is the ability for a state to run their own government without federal intervention. And the effect of having this now was that the Redeemers, these, as the critics called them, the Bourbons, or the Southern Democrats, passed a lot of laws that rejected any rights for blacks. They completely wiped out the social programs that were helping them and dismantled any type of integrated public schools. And the North was just like, nah, I don't really, whatever, I don't really care. We have our own problems to worry about. Just go do your thing. There are good and bad things that were left with the legacy of Reconstruction. The good things were the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, and the fact that literacy in universities in the South for African Americans were growing. But it mostly ended on a bad note. I'm surprised that anything good came out of it, to be entirely honest. There was really no real progress because, here's the thing, the radical Republicans who were making all these laws, they just thought that if you give them civil rights, everything's going to be okay. But you know what? They couldn't help them. They weren't helping the Southern blacks, the freedmen, with the economy, and they were not helping get rid of the racism in the South. They just kind of ignored it like it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, oh, if we just give them rights, everything will be okay. They didn't take care of those things, and all their progress that they made just completely went into the wind, and we're not going to see real progress until the 1950s again when it comes to getting rid of racism. So, that's it. Torch out.